So in the new series I'm doing, which I believe is going to be about 2 parts, I have another little bit of a niche project. This is the topper to a 1/4 pole marker for a horse racing track. It's actually a replica, and part of the bottom was completely broken off, and the customer not only wanted me to fix that, but then build a replica stand to go for this to go on. Obviously the stand's not going to be as tall as one you would see on a racetrack because this is going in their home, but it'll be similar in design to what you see there. So obviously the white part was original, and then the repair is all of this I did. So quite a large swath of the bottom was broken off, and I had to build back up the material and then carve it down. So like I said, this is a little bit of a niche project. These smaller projects are not necessarily projects I film for the channel because they are kind of specialty projects. But for this one, I decided to film it because even though, like I said, most people probably will not have a topper to a 1/4 pole laying around their house, the processes and the way I went about rebuilding the space is something you can apply to filling in voids or replicating any sorts of old millwork or old woodworking. So that is why I decided to film it. If you don't have something like this, like I said, if you have older woodworking to copy, you can kind of dissect this process and apply it to your needs. Now this is actually in general also a very cool piece of woodworking. At some point it was turned on a lathe because the bottom of it has markings from being on a lathe, and from cutting it apart it's solid mahogany. The central bowl here is solid mahogany, which makes it a really cool piece to work on in general. The finished piece is going to be about 6 feet tall. The topper itself is about 28 inches, and at the widest point it's about 18, I believe 18 inches wide. So it's quite large. The final piece is going to be quite large as well. The first video is going to be getting it to this point with the fixed portion, and then the second part of the video will be recreating the pole that this will stand on. Like I said, obviously not to scale, but design wise quite similar. So this is the topper as it was brought to my shop. You can see it's in pretty good shape. There's some cracks I'm going to fill and whatnot, but then on the other side of it, down at the base, is where the issue was. Now one option would have been to just completely cut off the base, turn a new piece and attach it, but because it's solid wood it's pretty heavy and I didn't want to do that. So you can see I drew a central line through here to kind of delineate where the rough patch was, and I decided that that would be way too much material to remove. It'd be a ton to fill, so I decided to cut it into basically off in 3 pieces. So I'm going to trim off the top first. Now this is obviously a ball. It's a little over 50 pounds, so it's not necessarily easy to wrestle with while I'm sawing. I came up with a clever way to hold this in place a little later after I struggled through multiple ways to keep this still as I was sawing off the rough pieces. There's also, this was outside at one point, so there is some water damage on the base. So that was the first little chunk I cut off. And then once that was off, I can move my marks over a little bit, which was nice. I wanted to keep as much of the original material in place as possible. You can see I drew 2 more vertical lines, and then I could trim this down. So once again, I'm kind of using my body as a clamp to hold this. I'm going to cut my 2 verticals with the saw going this way. I want these to be as square as possible because when I add the material, the more square these sections are, the easier it's going to be for myself. And at this point, I figured out if I held this in a crate, the piece couldn't move around nearly as much. It was also up off the ground a little bit, so it was a little bit easier on my back. And then I could go through and cut across the horizontal width into the piece and notch out those two bits. You can see my 2 saw marks meet, which means that's a pretty good sign that this is going to be fairly square. I could just finish up the cut and remove that piece. Did the exact same thing on the other side. I'm just checking, see how square it was. I had to do a little bit of sanding to square up the pieces, but right off the bat it was pretty good. There wasn't a lot of gaps. So then I could spin this around and do the exact same thing on the other side, just removing that chunk of material. Once that was done, I decided to remove a little more bit of this lip, just because the edge of it was fairly cut off. That's what I did. Now this is going to look a little crooked, but that's just because I go deeper on one side than the other. But essentially this is a fairly flat cut. And then obviously when I'm cutting this apart, I realized it was mahogany. I don't have mahogany, so I'm using cherry. I wanted a hardwood for this, so that, and one that didn't have a lot of grain texture, so I didn't have to deal with that. So I happen to have some cherry chunks laying around. This particularly is a 3x3 chunk that was cut off the bottom of a coffee table I made probably a few years ago. It fits in this section almost perfectly. I'm just trimming it down so I don't have a ton to sand afterwards, and then I can glue these two chunks in place. I have found over the years it's easiest to do this in sections. If you try and glue up all the pieces at once, it's going to be a little bit of a pain. So then that was the profile I drew on the cherry there, and then I also drew a profile on a piece of 1/4 inch ply before I started gluing everything together, so that I would have it. If you don't have chunks taken out of your piece, you can use a contour gauge if you have one to get that profile. It's just going to come in handy later down the line when I have it. Before I glued this up, before you could see with the profile, I took a little bit of material out so I don't have as much to remove at the end. And then I'm just using strap clamps to hold everything in place. These strap clamps are invaluable, especially on a circular surface. It's really hard to get straight edge clamps on there. Now this one side was a little bit thicker, so I started by removing some of the material with a chisel, so I wasn't going to sit here sanding it all day. You can see that this is a little bit of an angle, this piece, because I had more material to remove on one side than the other. That does not matter for this process. And then I just used a belt sander to even this out. You can see I'm using a ruler to check to make sure it's level. And then this, like I said, doesn't have to be perfect. If there's little hairline gaps, that's okay, because this is going to be finished at the end of the painted at the end of the day as well. So then at this point I needed a circle, so I knew how high to go and how wide to go. So I had some paper laying around from my last project that was already large enough to draw a circle on. I drew the arch that was still intact on one side. I spun it around and then filled in the gap by drawing it again on the bottom. So I had a rough circle at this point. I don't have a compass that goes as wide enough, is why I did it this way. And then you could see there's the circle I need. So at this point I had to go up about another 4 inches. So along with the cherry legs, I also had this longer piece of cherry that was a little over 1 inch, so I could get that 4 inches using this piece. I had just enough to go all the way across. At this point it's easier because I'm at a flat surface, and you can see I'm just gluing all of the pieces. Now the grain I'm keeping in line with the grain of the original piece, so the grain runs vertically up the whole piece, and that will make life easier when carving it as well. Use that triangle in the middle just to apply some pressure to the top. Had to add a couple clamps on this one, but once again I just glued it in place with strap clamps. It was warm outside this day but cold in the shop, so I glued that up outside so the glue could set a little bit faster. And then at this point, same thing, I could add the other layer. So the goal of this was to put those two outer edges so I had a flat surface to work off of, and then you could see I could do a straight line, and then on top of that, I'm using my circle to figure out how high I have to go. You could see that with another chunk of those coffee table legs, those little cherry coffee table legs, and then 2 leftover pieces of the about 1.5 inch material, I can get this last layer. Same exact process, gluing it all up. strap clapping it all in place and then letting it dry. So now if you had a big enough lathe, there's no reason why you couldn't chuck this back up in the lathe if you had the right materials and all of that and turn it again. I do not have a lathe big enough, so I'm going to have to do most of this with carving. So I started by flattening the bottom a little bit because I'm going to use a router jig in order to get my perfect circle on my edges. The hole in the center is about 10 inches deep. So I thought I could get away with using a dowel. So you could see I have a hole already placed in there. The metal faceplate to the router I have unattached. So I can lift off the router when I have the right placement, mark the holes, and then attach the plate to that 1/4 inch material and get perfect placement for the router. So that wasn't an issue, but that center hole was. So I plugged it with a dowel so I could put a lag bolt in there, and then I had my pivot point. So then I could just go through with this 3/4 inch rather deep bit and just cut that arch. This is a very simple jig. It was just a piece of 1/4 inch ply I had laying around. I marked a center point on there and then just drilled a wide hole for the bit, and then you could see the pivot hole in the back, and marking it with that detachable metal piece to the router was a huge time saver. Now this obviously isn't going to go all the way down, but it will go down deep enough that I go past the curve. As long as I go past the curve, I could just chisel off this excess material. I won't be using it in the end anyway. So you can see I got nice arch that matches the original curve. You could see that there's the curve. As long as I go past that, all of that extra material is excess. I'm going to be chipping it off anyway, so it doesn't matter that the router bit didn't go down that far. Now since this grain runs vertically, it's very easy. I could chip off this material and then start with removing some more of the excess. You could see with a chisel it pops off really, really quickly. So then I'm going to be making 2 more marks on this. The first one I'm doing now, and that's just marking where the curve starts on the base. So that will be the mark I work to, essentially. So I just have an adjustable tri-square there. So I'm just making that mark. You can see what it looks like. And that is where I'm going to be starting the curve and ending the curve, essentially. So then I have a handheld chainsaw. I'm actually testing this tool for a company. I'll be releasing a video of it in a couple weeks. This has been super handy around the shop just to remove the bulk of the material up top. You could see I could start by getting a nice curve. Just saves a lot of time with chisel work and grinding work to be able to do that. So that's all I did, was just slightly curve that top part. So then at this point I'm going to need that profile I made, so I could bring it to the scroll saw and just cut out that profile, because I'll be using it through the rest of this build. Now I started with chisels because I enjoy chisel work more than Dremel or rotary tool work, and the chisels do work. As you can see, I was able to take off the excess off the top, and then there's going to be a flat drop off, and then I was able to recreate that with a chisel as well, and then rough cut finish it up. This just took a long time, and you could see that even though I have this nicely sitting in that milk crate now, it does move around a lot. It is doable with chisels if you don't have rotary tools. It was just going to take a lot longer. Since this is a business, I didn't want to spend a couple days. That's an exaggeration. I didn't want to spend the extra time to chisel this out. So after this first little trial piece, I switched over to my die grinder. Now the die grinder I'm using because it's a little more powerful than a Dremel, but you can use a Dremel as well. I have a fairly abrasive, I would say a medium abrasive large spiked ball, going through and just removing the initial bulk of the material. I'm taking the bulk of the material off the top, and I'm taking a bulk of the material off the curve here, following that bottom line. So this is just taking a lot out without getting anywhere near the detailing portion. So you can see I'm using my profile to make sure I don't get too deep, cut too deep by accident while I'm not paying attention. So then I needed another marker, so I created a circle with a compass. I cut out the center and then obviously cut a splice in it so it could go around. It's the exact same diameter of this top circle. I could tape it to the piece and then mark that circle onto the front edge, and that was necessary in order to figure out how deep I had to go. You could see I had quite a ways to go, but I can mark this with a Sharpie and then continue using that ball in the die grinder and remove this bulk of the material. I didn't want to go past this. I don't want to go past either line essentially. Once that was done, I switched over to a cone bit, the same grit. You could see it's removing material very fast, but leaving quite a rough surface. And I came really close to that top line, creating that concave curve, and then bringing it down to the bottom line as well. This is still the roughing out phase. So then once I had that, I could switch over to the rotary tool. I'm using a die grinder bit. This is perfectly flat on the top, so you can see I'm going through and just going right up to that mark. This is not nearly as abrasive as a bit, so it's going to leave a clean cut. And then because this is a straight bit, I could go all the way down and create that flat drop off as well. I have my profile next to me the whole time, checking and making sure I'm not going too deep. I'm removing just enough material. And then this is when it really starts to look like how it should at this point. See, it creates a nice squared off part, using that profile to make sure I'm going down as far as I need to, as well as leaving a fairly clean surface because it is a die grinding bit. I just went around the whole piece this way. Once this was done, it was fairly good at this point. And then there's a little bit of a bump here, so I'm going through with the cone just to remove that, smoothing it all over, and just keep creating that profile, checking back all the time to make sure, like I said, I'm not going too deep. And then that's what I'm left with after going around the whole piece with the die grinder. And then after this, I'm taking that profile and sliding it. There's going to be little hairline gaps and some light showing through, but as soon as I get to a point where that profile doesn't match, that's where I start attacking the material again with the die grinder. You could see the profile rose off a little bit there, so I just went through and lowered that bump. You can see at this point it's a little bit more of a process because you're not removing nearly as much material. You can see there was a bump there. I'm lowering it, flattening it all out, squaring up that drop off, and then checking with the profile and moving along the piece. I did that the whole way as well. It was really only a couple spots that needed it there. At this point, I'm hand sanding the material. Because of all the curves, it's easiest to do it by hand. You can see the match is actually pretty good at this point. There will be a little bit more sanding and finishing work to do for this. I'm using a scraper. The scraper curved scraper worked perfect at the top. There will be some filling and stuff, which I'll most likely film, but as far as sanding, I'm not going to show much more of that because at this point, the incremental changes don't really show up on camera. But this is essentially where I'm at. That is the template for the base I'm building because the base is actually a hexagon. But I'm pretty happy with how that fill-in worked out.